All right, I think we're heading up on to the last team. They're Team Aurora. They're from Thunder Bay, Canada, and we have Russell and Ben on.
Hi there.
Hi.
So hi, everyone. My name is Ben Fedoruk. I'm a team member of Team Aurora Borealis. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the efficacy of carbon pricing at reducing emissions. Oh, shoot, sorry. So we'll be going through a few distinct sections today. First, we'll discuss the problem at hand, followed by our preliminary research, and then we will discuss our findings and analysis. Finally, we will provide some calls to action. So let's start by talking about the problem here. So if you weren't aware, since 1950, there have been drastic increases in carbon emissions for nations across the world. But how does that affect people's lives? Well, increased carbon emissions cause global temperatures to rise due to the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This causes, among other things, an elevation of sea levels, causing a mass flooding of coastal cities and more frequent, more dangerous weather events. You can see the increase in sea levels in these two photos of Florida, where sea levels have risen by 1 or 2 meters. Note that Miami, Jacksonville, and Orlando are completely submerged after only 2 meters of sea level rise. So upon contemplating ways to reduce carbon emissions, we began to think about carbon pricing. We came up with the research question, to what extent are different carbon pricing strategies effective solutions for reducing CO2 emissions? I implore all of you in the audience to think about your evolving answer to this question throughout the presentation. So we will now move on to some preliminary research. There are two main types of carbon pricing. First, an emissions trade system, or ETS, caps the total carbon emissions of a political region, whereby businesses hold permits limiting the amounts of CO2. These businesses may exchange permits, but the total number of permits in the nation and emissions in the country remain constant. Second, a carbon tax adds an additional tax on the consumer in hope that the raised prices will psychologically affect the decision-making process of the consumer. Sorry. Our team hypothesized that the data would present a noticeable drop in CO2 emissions after the implementation of carbon pricing strategies, but that it would be difficult to visually see in comparison to the myriad of factors which affect carbon emissions in a nation. So we used a range of data which allowed us to delve deeper into the specific carbon pricing policies which were implemented in the European Union and how that affected their carbon emissions. You can see the data sets we used displayed on the slide. As is the case with most data, our data had some limitations, namely our data ended in 2014. We focused our study on the European nations after 1980. Now we will move on to our findings and analysis. The EU ETS has caused drastic decreases in CO2 emissions for several nations. Using 2 lines to find a trend of data, you can see our generated graphs for carbon emissions over time for Portugal and Greece, who both implement the EU ETS, and Canada, who during the time period analyzed did not have any carbon pricing. So carbon pricing, in general, carbon pricing is beneficial, whether the model is an ETS or carbon tax or both. Carbon pricing has demonstrated a strong correlation to decrease in emissions. Nations should analyze the longer-term data presented in the EU ETS and analyze the model's advantages and shortcomings. We found that the price cannot be too high, it must be optimized. If you take a look at the graph for France's emissions over time, you can see that it might take upwards of 10 years to see any noticeable impact. So now we're going to make some calls to action. So first, I'd like to make some calls to action for the governments. We call for governments to implement a carbon pricing model consisting of both an ETS and carbon taxes. We call for governments to keep prices affordable and effective. We call for governments to limit total CO2 emissions for their nation. And we call for governments to implement border carbon adjustments to curb carbon leakage. So next, I would like to make some calls to action for businesses. Aurora Borealis calls for businesses to set internal company caps on CO2 emissions, to avoid carbon leakage by setting global standards, to keep prices affordable but effective, to pursue low CO2 solutions and resources, and to pursue carbon alternatives wherever possible. Sorry. Now I would like to call the public to action. These are calls to action for everyday citizens such as yourself. First, we call for you to be cognizant of your purchases. This means figuring out how much carbon you're using and finding alternative products to use or businesses to shop at. We call for you to learn the carbon policies of your frequented businesses. We call for you to take action within your community. We call for you to make your voice heard on carbon pricing, and we call for you to pursue carbon alternatives to high CO2 products. Sorry, pardon me. Lastly, I would like to make some calls to action for individual communities, such as provinces and cities. First, Aurora Borealis calls for communities to make alternative modes of transport readily available and accessible. We call for the implementation of gas subsidies for vulnerable sectors of the population. We call for encouragement of communal cooperation and connection in pursuit of the common goal of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We call for the funding of green infrastructure projects to create green jobs. Finally, we call for communities to tailor national carbon pricing policies to the specific situations of the locality. So obviously, through our research, we had limited time and data. However, there are many avenues of future research that the Aurora Borealis team would like to pursue. We could research into the potential Goldilocks zone for optimal carbon pricing values. We could research into border carbon adjustments and their effectiveness. We could look into the potential use of government funding for projects like researching optimized battery technology. One notable research point for the EU ETS specifically is the effects of the Stop the Clock initiative, where international flights are exempted from carbon pricing policies. I would now like to welcome Russell Frost to help me out with the Q&A session. We're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you and welcome, Russell. The first question that we have comes from Judge Stephen Murphy, and he said, can you clarify what calls to action are specifically related to your data analysis?
Okay, so relating to our data analysis specifically, I think one of the big takeaways goes for governments. So I think that would be specifically looking at keeping prices affordable and effective. That was for both governing and business stakeholders, as well as implementing both an ETS and carbon taxes, not one or the other, but doing a combination of the two. I think those are, I don't know if you have anything else to add there, Russell.
No, not for that one. I think you're still muted there.
Sorry about that. Which is better, ETS or tax?
So
I think
an implementation of both in certain cases can be seen to be effective, but it really is going to be a country by country basis as well. Some countries aren't going to be able to have as high of carbon taxes because their population won't be able to afford those, but other places might want to be bringing in more businesses and already have populations that are more wealthy, so that might be more effective for them as well. So it's going to be on a country by country base.
Okay. Is there noise in the data that could affect the analysis? For example, the major global recession of 2008.
We looked into that because that was a thought of ours as well. And it actually does appear that in some European nations, they did around 2008 to 2009, they did try to account for that in their carbon price specifically. It did have a drastic decrease in the tax. However, it did resume the next year back to normal levels of decrease. So we do assume that that was just an outlier.
Studies have shown that carbon pricing schemes don't work if the price is set too high, as you mentioned, but also if it's too low. You haven't had the time to find the Goldilocks zone, but what were the price per ton numbers for the countries you did examine, like Greece?
Yeah, so we were looking specifically, the range that seemed to be the best was around $10 to $20. So I think, yeah, we were looking at some nations such as Sweden, where they have in the hundreds, and we were also looking at nations that had values in the cents, right, like less than $1, which obviously neither of those, you're right, are optimal, but we think around the $10 to $20 range seems to be, at least for the European Union, the Goldilocks zone.
Okay. Carbon pricing is incredibly dependent on political will, and that is what killed the carbon market in 2014. Would your data help reverse that political will?
Russell, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that for political will, it's going to be, there's a big issue where people don't really understand long-term impacts, or at least it's difficult for people to understand long-term impacts. So as far as political will, one of the best ways to get people to care would be to show visualizations of how these increased carbon emissions directly link to climate data. We didn't have necessarily a lot of really good climate data, and climate data is really hard to get because the climate of one country will be influenced by the carbon emissions of all the countries around it and all the things the other countries around them are doing. So you really need global climate data, and there's a lot of countries that might have inaccurate climate data due to their data collection techniques or a myriad of other factors. So when it comes to actually getting that political will, our data could help with that, but it really depends on how it's interpreted and linked to other data.
Okay.
Really showing those effects would be the biggest part in creating that political will.
Okay, thank you. So did you consider whether efficacy is related to whether the pricing scheme is revenue neutral? Is it better when the fee is returned to the consumer in tax relief?
We haven't looked into that. I don't know if Russell has any other thoughts, but like from my perspective, I think that's something that would be very important to look into. I think one of the things we were talking about in terms of the stakeholders was looking at ways to help, especially the vulnerable sector, because I think that they are people who this is going to affect quite a bit, right? It's obviously an increase in cost of living. So yeah, so that's something to look into. I don't think we really had the time or data to go into that level of research, but we would be interested in going there in the future.
Really quickly, I would just add that like the ETS, with the ETS, the government does make money from it. I'm not sure exactly, again, we don't know exactly what types of returns to the community are the best, but definitely reinvesting those earnings into public programs would be, I think, incredibly important for creating that public will, because when the public also gets something from it, that's another thing that people like, getting things. So.
Okay, and then just last question we've got, how are we sure that the correlations you have shown represent causal effects on the measures?
Well, I mean, realistically, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's a lot of factors. Obviously, carbon pricing is one influencer. However, it seems when you look at the graphs that we have, at the time when it's initially, or in 2005, when the EU ETS is implemented, the graphs have that steep turn, right? So that's essentially, obviously it's not causation, but we've noticed the correlation there, and I think that's something to explore further as well.
Okay.
We only did have the 10 days to work on it, so we couldn't really look at all the factors, and we also only had the data that we had, so we couldn't be grabbing like the titles of news articles and relating keywords and that to differences in carbon emissions and that kind of stuff as well, and differences in climate. It's just, there's a bit of a limitation on the data that we have.
And that was something that I think we would have liked to do, would be to look at, analyze the economic data of a country and compare that specifically. I believe there was a question earlier about the 2008 recession, and that was something that we were actually talking to our mentor about doing, but obviously we didn't have the data for it.
Okay, fair enough. No, great job with what you've got, and definitely inspired the attention of the judges. So great job, and thank you very much. At this point, we come to the end of all of our presentations from both the challenge as well as the datathon component. And so we are going to be breaking for a short intermission while the judges deliberate all of the presentations before